So we're heading back into Graham Ward's testimony now as he discusses the standards for conducting an investigation, which we're already questioning based off what we already know. Ironically, for a casework management team as part of a security team in the post office that was so concerned with making documents look pretty, they appear to have omitted fairly key things from some of their own documents, such as, dates. But the most shocking part by far is the post office at this stage are aware of their, quote, major procedural weaknesses, and they are not addressing them, but making sure that they try as hard as possible not to disclose them to subpostmasters legal teams. Let's jump into the inquiry.
Mr. Ward, can we look, please, at poll 0010-4747? And if we just look at the foot of the page, please, you'll see there's no date here. Go over the page and keep going, and keep going, and again, and keep going, and keep going. And keep going, sorry. You'll see that it's consistently not dated at the foot of the page.
And for a team that's involved in making documents look pretty, as we saw in the previous video, they certainly didn't make sure their own documents had things like dates on them.
But that this is a document, stop there, thank you. Just scroll up. A document that is said to be effective from March 2000. Do you see that?
Yes.
And at this time, you would have been an investigation manager.
That's correct, yeah.
Okay, if we go back to page 1, please. You'll see that it's described as a casework management document, part of investigation policy. And it's addressed to, I think, linked to accountability security managers. That would include you, yes?
Correct.
And the purpose of the document is the aim of this policy is to ensure that adequate controls are in place to maintain standards throughout the investigation processes. Very interesting indeed, as it doesn't seem the standard of the investigations was that high from what we've heard so far.
And the aim is to ensure that adequate controls are in place to maintain standards throughout investigation processes. So I suspect this is a document you can no longer remember, but would have been something with which you would have been familiar at the time.
Exactly, yeah.
Thank you. And if we look at reporting standards in the third box down, and look at the sort of a preamble to what we're going to look at in a moment, some criticism of refusing to disclose investigation reports, in the first bullet point there. And then if we can go over the page, please, to the second page, and look at the third bullet point. In England and Wales, legal services will decide what information will be disclosed to the defence in compliance with the CPIA 1996. So I've moved over all the parts that are about disciplinary and employment law processes to look at crime. And then the next bullet point down, if during the course of an inquiry failures in security or operational procedures are identified which may or may not be directly connected with the offences under investigation, a separate report should be made to the relevant function or line manager in order that remedial action should be taken. In the interest of maintaining good industrial relations and to maintain confidentiality, it's important that individuals are not named in this report and recommendations are made in general terms. The separate report will need to be listed on CS06D and possibly on E, and legal services will then decide whether such a report should be disclosed to the defence under the CPIA 1996. And then the next bullet point, the issue of dealing with information concerning procedural failures is a difficult one. Some major procedural weaknesses, if they become public knowledge, have the potential to assist others to commit offences against the Post Office, or to undermine the prosecution case, or to bring consignia into disrepute, or harm relations with major customers, unless the offender states he's aware that accounting weaknesses exist and he took advantage of them. It's important not to volunteer that option to the offender during interview. The usual duties of disclosure under the CPIA 1996 still apply.
So it seems like there we're going to say, actually, we're going to cover up the fact that we have major procedural weaknesses because people would be upset. I mean, it's right, they would use it potentially if somebody was that way inclined to potentially commit a criminal offence against the post office. But they seem predominantly worried with the undermining prosecution cases that they've got are major customers, e.g., the government, being extremely unhappy at their, quote, major procedural weaknesses. And they're saying, well, we can't deny it if it's said, but certainly don't trigger or incite someone under interview to actually volunteer this information. If you're aware that there's major procedural weaknesses in your organisation, why aren't you addressing them?
Thank you. That can come down. With that document in mind, can you tell us how you, when you were writing reports as an investigation manager, addressed the issue of what were described there as security procedure failures, operational procedure failures, or procedural weaknesses, or procedural failings?
And just by the way, as executives in an organisation, if you've identified so many failures and you genuinely believe you are a victim of all these crimes, then you actually wouldn't want all these cases to be appealed and fall apart based on weaknesses that you're aware of that you seem not to be addressing. You would tighten up everything that you could to ensure that crimes couldn't be committed against your organisation. So that in and of itself, completely separate from what's happened in terms of the subpostmasters there, you would certainly think that that's a bit of a slapdash way to run an organisation.
So I'm going back probably 22 years since I've probably dealt with a case. So it's very difficult for me to remember any specific cases that I dealt with where there were procedural failings.
Do you think
There obviously would have been some, but I really just cannot remember. There was one case I can remember, that just come back to me. It was a case involving a recruitment of a counter clerk working at a Crown office. And cutting a long story short, the person that turned up at the branch as a new member of staff wasn't the person that went for an interview. And the only way it was found out was just his misfortune that the person who interviewed him was the branch manager at the office he turned up at. And the procedural failing there was that there was no photograph attached to the documents that were sent to the to the branch manager. So that was a procedural failing, which was highlighted in the report. So any procedural failings that you would come across.
When you say it was highlighted in the report, what do you mean by the report?
So the offender report that I would have prepared for that case.
This tended to indicate that needed to be addressed separately in a different document that went to and only went to legal services. Can you remember that being the rule?
So the procedural failing would be in the report that went to legal services, but the procedural failing in the report that went to the discipline manager wouldn't be there.
And why was that? Did you understand what the rationale was for that?
So my understanding of the rationale for that would be that the discipline report would be available to the person being disciplined, which would then mean that you're highlighting a failing that could be communicated to everyone else.
Might that not...
Surely to do the job, though, that they are doing, they need to be aware of these things. I mean, you either trust your employees and your subcontractors, or you don't. If you don't highlight the procedural failing to the people on the front line, as it were, then how are they supposed to be aware, A, that it's a failing, and B, to be on guard against people taking advantage of it? Because surely in an organisation as large as the post office, these procedural failings or gaps in the system, if you like, would become common knowledge in the end just through people talking about them.
What would be relevant to their discipline case?
Well, in the case I dealt with, not really, I don't think, no.
Can you recall a case in which, other than the one you've just mentioned, in which it would be relevant, or maybe?
I mean, of course it's relevant, because if you turn around and say, actually, the failing in this case is the wrong person started the job, then surely what you would say is, actually, can you check, I don't know, some identification of all new staff members when they join and take a copy? So, whilst he's kind of saying, well, we'll correct that by attaching a photo to the application, by keeping some of your managers in the dark, or all of your managers who are actually in the post offices in the dark, you're not allowing them to the opportunity to fulfill a role to tighten up these procedural weaknesses and guard against new procedural weaknesses emerging.
May be relevant.
Not off the top of my head, no. Sorry.
Okay, in relation to criminal cases, it seems that the documents were not to be sent to, from this policy, the criminal law team, but a report setting out what the procedural weakness or failing was to be sent to the criminal law team. Are you saying that was essentially within the offender report?
Sorry. The
Yes.
procedural failing that was identified within the offender report,
Yes.
it would be in the offender report, yes.
Right, okay. There wasn't a yet third report, a
No.
separate report. Okay,
No,
that
it
was
would
in
be-
the offender report. Okay.
Yeah.
What was your role as an investigator in ensuring that the post office in such cases complied with its duty of disclosure?
So my role for disclosure would be, it's the investigator's role to disclose everything that would undermine the prosecution, support the defence.
No, you're working, I think, here hypothetically because
Yeah.
you never found a case in which there was anything that undermined the prosecution.
Not that I can recall.
No.
I mean,
And he's making that admission again. I mean, he's now saying, not that I recall, but that is shocking. Surely you must have come across a scrap of something as part of any thorough investigation if you've run any number of investigations which might cast even a shadow of doubt on the accusation that you are making. I would say that's the case of all law enforcement cases. It doesn't mean that they're going to it's going to fatally undermine a case, but what it does mean is there is evidence not only to support the conclusion that you've come to, but potentially also some evidence, however minor and however less in weight you put into it, that might potentially suggest another cause.
I'm going back 22 years was the last time I dealt with a case myself, so I'm sure there may have been, but I just can't recall.
Was the limit of the responsibility to make legal services aware of it, or did the investigator perform a separate role of disclosure officer?
My role would have been to have made legal services aware of it. That's my understanding.
Did you ever act as a disclosure officer in any prosecution case?
No, I didn't know.
And that's a bit of a contradiction, surely. So it was my responsibility to disclose, but I wasn't the disclosure officer. Well, if he wasn't and it was his responsibility to do it, then who was the disclosure officer on these cases?